Just taking a few names, that's all. Thank you. I'm always moved by the music. Are you moved by the music here?
Yeah.
I'm always moved by the music and also moved by the lyrics. And it is, I should be used to it by now, but it's amazing how many times the lyrics and what I have to say in my message are so complementary. So I want you to remember these two lines from the song, and as I get toward the end of my message, I want you to remember how congruent they are. I am on your side was one of the lines, and the other one was let your guard down. Let your guard down. I am on your side. Because I want to share a story with you about a man who did exactly that, who let his guard down, and even in the midst of something that maybe we can't even imagine, he really was saying, without saying those words, I am on your side. So, anyway, take note. I wrote them down so I can remind you. So this new series I'm calling Radical. It was inspired by this book by Brene Brown called Braving the Wilderness. And what I said in, if you read the Facebook or the introduction on the website, what I wanted you to know and what I believe is that your spiritual home should be a place you go to get some guidance for your life. Like, we shouldn't separate what we do spiritually and then what we do the rest of the week. That we should be able to come to our spiritual home and be aware of tools or ideas that help us negotiate our life. Like to be spiritual all the time and to not separate those two. And I think if a spiritual home doesn't do that, that we fall short. That we fall short as a community. Because that's really what it's all about. It's not just hanging out, and we love doing this, hanging out with like-minded folks. A lot of us have such comfort hanging out with like-minded folks. But we don't do that with all of our life. I mean, we run into people and we work with people and we engage with people who aren't necessarily like-minded. So I think we need to come to our spiritual home, and I'm calling this that for you, and find out how and get some guidance on how to do that. How to open up our minds and our hearts and to really be stimulated to think about how we're acting and behaving in the world. I say every Sunday here that at Spiritual Soul Center we're here to create a movement grounded in loving kindness. But sometimes when we look about what's happening in the world, we don't see too much of that, do we? And we might get frustrated with that because the first person we run into, or the second, or the first person on Monday is not what we would call filled with loving kindness. And so we get a little thrown off. So what about if we learn a way to help ourselves in that regard? The other Spiritual Soul Center truth, if you look at the website or other on Facebook, we say we are here to be and express love. Love is what we are, and love is what we see in others. Whew, that's a lofty vision, isn't it? Love is what we are, and love is what we see in others. Not always the way the week goes, right? Not always the way the week goes that we know that we are love at our core, and that we see that in others. So this series is really about self-reflection and saying, well, what am I really living the life that I want to live spiritually? And do I really come from those places in my own life? And if I'm not, am I willing to make a shift and live radically? Because it is a radical shift. Most people do not live from loving kindness with people that aren't like-minded. We like being in that comfort zone. I can tell you I do. It's nice hanging out with people who think the way I do. But it's not going to stimulate my own spiritual growth necessarily. So Brene Brown in this book talks about living life either zoomed in or zoomed out. Zoomed in or zoomed out. And when we live a zoomed out life, it's supported by the 24-hour news cycle, by the way. The 24/7, 365, always in your face, what's happening with bobbleheads telling us what's going on and what we should think about what's going on. That's living life zoomed out. Living life zoomed out is being able to say whatever you want on Facebook or Twitter, anonymously pretty much. Nobody's knocking on your door. Living life zoomed out really is living life disconnected. Living life zoomed in is about your day-to-day, getting up out of bed, the feet hitting the floor, the people you encounter. It's a totally different way of looking at life from a zoomed out perspective or a zoomed in perspective. Here's some ideas that Brene Brown talks about to illustrate this. You might recognize them. They happen to be political in nature. Here's the political rhetoric. Democrats are such losers. Your experience. As a lifelong conservative, this sounds about right. But what about your closest friend at work, the one who drove you to the hospital when you got the call that your husband had a heart attack at the gym and was being rushed to the ER? The one who sat with you in the CICU and then raced to pick up your kids from school and take them to her house? The one who helped you plan the funeral and shouldered your workload while you were out? She's not a loser. In fact, you love her. And she's a Democrat. Here's another one. Republicans are selfish jerks. As a Democrat, you totally agree, except for your son-in-law, who is a loving and wonderful husband to his wife, the most amazing father to your granddaughter. Thank God he's in the family. Even more than your daughter, he's the one who sends the pictures, the cute pictures, and keeps you connected to your sweet granddaughter. He's not selfish, he's not a jerk, and he's a Republican. Here's another one. Anti-abortion activists are hypocrites and closed-minded fundamentalists. As an active feminist, you couldn't agree more. Except for that great teacher you had in your Catholic high school. She had more integrity than anyone you know. And she constantly encouraged you to think critically about tough issues, even when it meant disagreeing with her. She's actually the one who taught you how to be an effective activist. She's not a hypocrite or closed-minded, and she's pro-life. What if what we experience close up is real, and what we hear on the news and from the mouths of politicians who are jockeying for power needs to be questioned? It is not easy to hate people close up. So what if? What if life was really about what we experienced close up and not when we zoomed way out, when we were able to make generalizations about big groups and associate ourselves with people we don't even know? What if life was really about living close up? That's something to think about, don't you think? It's a different way of believing how life is. Instead of looking from way out, we zoom in and believe that's what life's really about. I can see you thinking about the people who've helped you. Well, I can tell you that what we're really talking about here is finding our common ground, finding things that we have in common. And Jesus was a great teacher about this. He demonstrated this all the time in his life. Let me read to you from John chapter 8 about finding the common ground, about being challenged in the moment, and instead of going to that zoomed out position, staying right there close up. And you'll remember this. This is from the Message Bible. The religious scholars and Pharisees led a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery to Jesus. They stood her in plain sight of everyone and said, "Aha! Teacher, this woman was caught red-handed in the act of adultery. Moses in the law gives us orders to stone such persons. What do you say?" And it said that Jesus bends down and kind of scratches in the dirt, right? He doesn't engage that person right away. But they kept badgering him, and finally he stood up and he said, "The sinless one among you, you go first. You throw the first stone." Bending down again, then he wrote something else in the dirt. And there was this kind of silence, I can imagine. And hearing what he had said, they began to walk away one by one. One by one, they dropped their stones and walked away. And finally, Jesus stood up and looked around, and nobody was left to throw a stone. And he said to the woman, "Where'd they go? Doesn't anybody condemn you?" And she said, "No, no one's here to condemn me." And he said, "Neither do I. So go on your way and don't do that stuff anymore. You're missing God in all this. Don't do it again." You see, when Jesus was challenged, the first thing he didn't do was to challenge back at that person and those Pharisees, those people who were questioning. He found some common ground. What was the common ground? We all make mistakes. We all aren't perfect. And when those people's minds, when our minds click to that place, when we realize we have something in common, we drop our stones, we drop our defenses, or we drop our offense, right? We drop that stone and get rid of it, because there's something in common. In Brene Brown's stories and examples, what the common ground there is, people close up care. You know, there's not an EMS or a friend of ours or a neighbor of ours who asks for our ID and our political affiliation and our sexual orientation before they help us. Close up, they don't, do they? Most people. Now you might say, well, this one person one time, and I'd say, okay, this one person one time. But in general, that doesn't happen. The people who deliver our mail, the people who hold the door, the people who let us in traffic, the people who cut our hair, the people who check us out at the grocery store, the people who are kind to us, they don't believe the same stuff we do. Are you kidding me? That doesn't happen. But they're kind. They care. Not all of them. But you're not kind and caring all the time either. We have our days and our moments. But in general, close-up people care. Looking for the common ground. That's true. Close up. Zoomed out, not so much. So, I want to tell you a story about a hero of mine. Cue lyrics. He's a man whose name is Daryl Davis. And Daryl Davis is not somebody I've ever met before. He is a descendant of slaves. He is a blues piano player. And he is one of my heroes. Anybody know the name Daryl Davis? Oh, we're in for a treat. He may become your hero also. He was playing his blues piano in a bar some years ago. He was a 25-year-old black man. And this white man, after he's done playing, comes up to him and was complimenting on how well he played the blues piano. And he couldn't believe it. He was like, "Man, that's the best I've ever heard. You know, I don't know anybody who could play the piano like that except Jerry Lee Lewis." And the black man kind of chuckled and thought, man, he doesn't know Little Richard or Fats Domino, who played this kind of music way before Jerry Lee Lewis did. And so they were sitting together having a drink. And he's thinking that in the back of his mind and having the conversation with him. And the man says, as part of that conversation, "Well, I've never even sat and had a drink with a black man before." And Daryl was taken aback a little more. And he kind of looked quizzically at him, and this man's friend was poking him, saying, "Tell him why, tell him why, tell him why you haven't." And the man says, well, he searches in his wallet amongst his credit cards and IDs and pulls out a Ku Klux Klan membership card. And tells Daryl that that's the reason that he's never sat with a black man before. Well, Daryl was pretty much taken aback by that. Didn't know what to say, but recognized, even in that moment, as a 25-year-old man, that they had something in common. And that was music. And he said that was a seed. That was a seed that was planted in him, and a desire to engage with people who were members of the Ku Klux Klan and find out the answer to this question: how can you hate me when you don't even know me? How can you hate me when you don't even know me? So fast forward a little bit of time, and he was in the car with a Klansman. He had followed his heart to do this. He had decided this was his mission in life, or part of his mission. He's still a bluesman. To follow this desire, to want to engage with what others in his particular situation would call the enemy, those who hate him. And he was in the vehicle, he was driving, and this one imperial wizard kind of person with the Ku Klux Klan was beside him. And he made a statement. He said, this. He said, well, we all know that all black people have within them a gene that makes them violent. And Daryl said, well, I've never been violent a day in my life. No carjackings, no drive-bys, nothing. I'm not a violent person. And the guy says to him, well, that may be so. That gene in you just must be latent. It hasn't come out yet. Well, Daryl took a deep breath, as you might imagine. There's this man sitting next to him, getting pretty smug, actually, because Daryl doesn't have something to say right off. But Daryl, he's my hero, and he's going to come up with something, and here's what he says. Thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, we know that all white people have a gene within them that makes them a serial killer. He said, name 5 black serial killers. Well, the man sat there, obviously could not name 5 black serial killers. And so Daryl says, well, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Charles Manson, all whites. He said, son, you have a serial killer gene in you. And the man says, now come on, Daryl, you know I have never killed anyone in my life. How could you say that? Well, he says, that gene must just be latent in you. It hasn't come out yet. And the man says, well, that's just stupid. That doesn't make a bit of sense. And he says, yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. It makes about as much sense as what you said about me. And 5 months later, according to Daryl, that man was no longer a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Daryl has a way about him. More recently, he showed up in Charlottesville, Virginia. Not the day that United for the Right rally happened and one person was killed, but on a follow-up day to meet with a grand imperial wizard that he had met with before. He was the grand imperial wizard of the Rebel Brigade Knights, and he was there to meet with him for the second time. The man was there to support a colleague of his who had shot a gun in the air, and Daryl was going to be there to meet with him. He approached him, he said, what's going on, man? How you doing? And they shake hands and they pat each other on the back. The Ku Klux Klan imperial wizard and the son and the descendant of slaves in the middle of the tension in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the one who believed that mixing of races was against God's will. He had a hat on that said heritage, not hate. And they were chatting in a place where other people were getting very upset with Daryl for engaging at all in any conversation with this imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. But he continued, and here's what this article said. He says, Daryl listened despite knowing what this guy, he was listening to this guy talk about the Klan, knowing the vile and violent history and its penchant for hanging, raping, and terrorizing black people in America. He stood right there. Even when people of his own color were telling him he was crazy and calling him all kinds of names. In fact, defending this guy in front of them, saying, hey, listen, I'm here to do... But they would stop him every time. That was too raw, it was too emotional for most people to handle. But they talked. And as they talked, something unusual happens. Both men realize that they shared the same feeling about the Unite to Right rally. Both say it had nothing to do with Confederate statues. Daryl says, you know what, this was all about starting a race war. And the other guy said, you're exactly right. Wow, how does he do this? And not back away, to find that common ground. Well, he sat with that man in the courthouse for 2 hours while he was waiting to be there to support his, the man who had shot the gun in the air. He spent 2 hours with him. He had defended him against these people who were yelling at him, telling him he was not to be there. And he believed that this made a difference, that he had planted a seed by being with someone who was hateful toward him. And on his drive home, he said, his phone rang. And it's this imperial wizard calling to make sure he got home safely. He had just witnessed this imperial wizard, a black man, standing up for him against protesters and caring about his colleague who was in court that day. And so Daryl says, this is how it begins. This is how it begins, to plant a seed and nurture it. To plant a seed and nurture it. To not be afraid. To not back down. To get close in. To zoom close in right next to someone who would hate me just for being alive. That's amazing. That's my hero. That's my hero who can actually do that day in and day out and believe that by planting a seed that things can be different. To allow it to grow, to allow the other person. I mean, can you imagine the guy called him to see if he got home all right? That's hard for us to imagine, isn't it? And I'll tell you, this is a radical way of living. Radical! Radical to be right next to somebody who hates me. Radical! This is not for the faint of heart. I mean, Daryl had done some work, hadn't he? He had done some personal work. He had made a commitment to himself to show up as love every time. All the time. With everybody. Especially those who would hate him for being who he is. So, I think in Brene Brown's examples and in this example, there are a couple of strategies that we can use. If we are willing to live radically, we can go back to our comfort, to hang out with like-minded folks, and feel like by doing that we can change the world, or we can live radically. And the first thing is, and this is what Daryl demonstrates, is we need to listen to understand. If we are listening and in the meantime making up the story in our defense so as soon as that person's done talking we can let them know what we think, we aren't listening, we're pretending to listen. We're pretending to listen. If we listen to understand, we are listening to that other person without any ulterior motive but to understand where they're coming from. Listening to understand is key. That's a radical way of being. Daryl simply wanted to know, how could you hate me when you don't know me? I want to understand what that's about. Listening to understand is a radical way of being. The other thing that Daryl taught me as my hero is that you have to educate yourself about what the other side thinks. You know, in those articles that I was referencing, and they'll be on the Facebook and on the website so you can read them yourselves this week, he educated himself. He said he knew more about what the Klan was about than most Klan members. And he didn't believe what the talking heads were telling him. He did his own research. He spent the time understanding the other side. How many people read op-eds that are opposed to their way of thinking? How many people read articles sitting right here? How many of us read what the opposite side is talking about? Or do we click on their only website that supports the way we think? Are we educating ourselves about how someone can feel and think a different way? That's what Daryl did. He said, my weapon is knowledge. It's not a gun or harsh words. It's knowledge. We need to educate ourselves. That's a radical way of thinking. That's a radical way of being, I should say. I say, well, it takes a little time to do that. That's why it's radical. Radical stuff isn't easy stuff. And the final thing, which really is coming around to where I started, is we have to be able to look and find our common ground. When we're close in like that, we can find it. We can find the things, whether it's music, in Daryl's case, in the first example, whether it's listening enough to find something to say that shifts our mind into the place where we realize that we are the same, much more than we're different. When we find out that common ground, when we live zoomed in, we can do that. We have to quit being in our place back here, zoomed out in our judgmental state. We have to zoom in and find and have in our consciousness, like Jesus did, in that moment when people are attacking us, what do we have in common? We have to think about that. Because there's issues that are bothering you right now. You know they are. Maybe it is racism. Maybe it's inequality in all its forms. Maybe it's the environment. Maybe it's about guns, gangs, the treatment of the elderly or prisoners or the mentally ill, Republicans or Democrats or evangelists. Maybe it's something local like Gen X or charter schools. Pick something. We need to stop hanging out with everybody who feels exactly the way we feel. We need to zoom in and be right next to them. I want to be right next to the guy with the AR-15. I want to know what he's thinking or what she's thinking. I want us to find a way together, because when we zoom in, it makes all the difference. People are hard to hate close up. We got to move in. So let's take a deep breath. Let's just let these ideas lay on our hearts. We don't have to run out the door and do anything this minute. We simply need to open our mind a little bit, open our heart a little bit. And maybe we can begin to believe that the truth about living is what we know when we're close up, when we're zoomed in. When we're zoomed into life, that's what's important. And then we will take time to educate ourselves. We will commit to listening to understand. We will commit to always be looking for the common ground. When we do that, like Daryl says, we plant a seed. We let it be nourished by the mind that is shifted out of that rut of thinking. And we allow the other, as we allow ourselves, to come to a different place. Come to a greater understanding, to become the love that we desperately want to see in all the world. Zoom in. Get close. Don't be afraid. Find the common ground. Know that it's there. Know that love exists at the core of every living being. Move in. Don't be afraid. Get close. Let your guard down. Be the love. Be radical. Don't let other people determine how you will live. Be radical. Be love. Let your guard down. Feel that freedom. Let the tension go. Stand strong. Be love. You got this. I know it. So with a deep breath in and out, we let these ideas stir at the core of us. We see the possibility, and we are grateful for my hero, Daryl Davis, black man, bluesman, and in my eyes, saint. Thank you. And amen. So open your eyes. Be here, be now, in this place. Awake together. Yes. Yeah. Thank you all. Feels good, yes? Yeah. So I invite you to consider how you want to honor the God of your understanding through your gift or your tithe